So if you're going to run a business, one of the decisions that you have to make is what form or what legal form that business will take. And there are a number of considerations for that. How easy it is to set up that structure, how much it's going to cost you to set up that structure, what the tax implications are of using that structure, the impact on your liability or risk, the ability for you to expand, which would mean that you need to actually raise capital, and also the ongoing compliance obligations that might come along with the structure. So there's no one solution to what's the best way to run a business. There's a balance occurring between the various pros and cons of the legal structures. Now, in general, most people are going to choose a corporate structure for a business of any size. But despite that, I still think it's really important that you understand all the different kinds of structures, because sometimes you can end up in a business structure that you didn't plan to. And we'll get into how that can occur as we go through. So the first legal structure that we want to deal with is sole trader. As that name suggests, sole trader. It's you running the business as you. So just say you bake a load of muffins, sell them through Instagram, or you decide to go to a ring making workshop and start selling some rings through Instagram. You'd actually be considered a sole trader, whether or not you'd even thought about it. That's legally the business structure that you've adopted. So let's have a look at how that would actually operate. So let's just say I decide to start a business, Gavin's Rings. What does that mean? Well, that means there's me, you or me, let's put Gavin is at the center of this business, and I actually start out making all the rings, but I have to go out and I have to buy some materials. Like I say, I've got to buy some metal and I've got to buy some tools. And I start making these specific rings, which I then sell over the gram to my specific customers. So I've got my suppliers, I get my tools from Bunnings, I got my metal supplier, and I'm selling to my customers. Now things are going okay, but I need to start making a greater variety of money. So I need to actually get more metal, which means I need to get some cash. Now under a sole trader, I have to provide those funds, right? I might actually get a loan with a bank, right? But I have to come up with the money. And I, Gavin, have to take on a loan. I might also decide to employ someone to run my Instagram. So I'm going to employ them. So I pay them money, they run Instagram for me. And it could be a traditional, could be a contract arrangement or whatever, but you start to get the idea. I am responsible for everything. I can engage employees to run Instagram. I can go to the bank and get a loan to get money, but I have to come up with the money. I make all the decisions. I'm making the rings or deciding who makes the rings. Plus, the big factor is I get all the profit, of course, if there is any. So, big pluses. I get all the profit. I have all control in this situation. But hopefully just drawing that diagram gives you some insight into where the problems or the disadvantages of this model actually lie. Yes, I get all the profit. Yes, I get all the control. Yes, they get to do what I want to do. But I am responsible and liable for everything. Legally, it's Gavin selling a ring, not a business. Me is selling the ring. Me, I promise to employ you, and if the business can't pay your wages, I have to pay your wages. If the business starts to go bad, my ring designs are no good, I personally have to pay the bank back. And not only that, the bank can come and sue me and take my house if I don't pay them the business loan back. Same for suppliers, etc. What we would say from a business and legal perspective is I have unlimited personal liability, right? Unlimited, every debt, every piece of negligence done, everything, it's unlimited, however much that is. There's no limitation to it. Unlimited. Personal, it's down to me, Gavin, not the business, not Gavin's Rings, Gavin. Unlimited personal liability. Key problem with being a sole trader. A second key problem that you can see from this diagram is it becomes very difficult to sell Gavin's rings. Why? Well, one way that some theorists look at a corporation is that it's a nexus of contracts. Like really a corporation is just like this bundle of contracts together. I'll get into more detail in that when we get to the corporation. But what you can see here is why they would think that. Look at all the contracts going on. That's why we studied contract law. It's so absolutely critical to understanding business. But the issue for me is if I want to sell the business to you, all of the contracts are in my name. I have to get the supplier to agree to contract with you. I have to get the employee to agree to be employed by you. I have to get the loan changed over into your name. If I have a lease, I have a premises, I have to get that changed over into your name. That's a huge problem. So succession and exiting a business becomes a major problem as a sole trader, right? If you are looking to sell your business at the end of the day, once you've built it to a certain size, super difficult from a sole trader perspective because you are the business. You are the business. So we can see we have that problem of personal unlimited liability. Another big advantage is that there's very, very few legal requirements because it's just as though you're running it personally. If you use a different name, like if I use Gavin Nicholson's rings, I probably wouldn't need to register it. But if I use the names Nico's Rings or Gav's Big Ring, if I use something like that, I would have to register it under the Business Names Act. That's just so that people can find out who's actually doing the operations. And then also there are GST requirements. If I get to a certain size, I'm going to have to register for the business tax of the goods and services tax. So there are some legal and compliance requirements of a sole trader, but they're very minimal. It's the cheapest way and least complicated way that you can actually run a business. So why don't we have a look at these advantages and disadvantages as we balance them up? So when you're a sole trader, there are very few formalities that you need to comply with. You get all the ownership, so that means you have all of the control. You make all the decisions. You get all the cash, all of the profits, and you don't get double taxed. If you run a company, the company might pay tax, and then you give yourself some money after the company has paid tax, and then you can pay tax on that again as personal income tax, right? So this is what they mean by the only tax on profits payable is your personal income tax, okay? So you're only paying this tax under a sole trader. You're not going to pay tax under a different structure as if you were part of a company. So in some instances, it can lower ultimately the amount of tax you pay for the business that you operate. But there are significant disadvantages. Personal liability, unlimited liability, including negligence, and contracts would include things like loans. Okay, so you're liable for everything. You can only raise as much capital as what you can raise personally. So if the bank's not going to lend you any money and you can't give it, and you can't get anyone to give you some money as a loan to run it, and essentially your sources of capital are limited to loans, either from a bank or family or friends. So if you can't get anyone to loan you capital, then you can't scale or grow if you need capital to grow. You might not have all the skills you need, particularly if it starts growing rapidly and you need more skills in different areas than what you're traditionally trained. It can be very difficult to exit the business for that reason that you hold all the contracts. And consequently, and similarly, it can be very difficult to build what they call goodwill, or essentially a reputational capital, because the company actually is you. So what you tend to find is sole traders are for those kinds of businesses that are pretty close to being either an individual contractor and or more on the borderline of being a hobby, a business that's pretty close to being a hobby, right? So it can work if you're a freelancer, or maybe you're making beeswax candles and you sell them once a week down at the West End markets. But once you start scaling beyond that, these disadvantages start to outweigh the advantages. Now, there are things about the liability that might scare you at first about a sole trader, but without going into detail, there are ways to offset it. Things like insurance policies, etc., that you could take out if you're worried about negligence liabilities, for instance. So there are ways to mitigate some of the negatives here, but as soon as you start hitting any scale, Maybe you need capital to grow. Maybe you need to start employing a number of people because your business is growing so much. And the skills level starts to expand beyond what you personally have. You're going to look beyond this sole trader approach. But it can be a good way to initially pilot, test an idea, make sure a business can work. Okay, so imagine Gav's ring is taken off, and now we need to think about some other people that we need to join our business. And if we do that, we might want to think about, or we might naturally start to think about, having a partnership. Let's look at that in the next video.